Hey guys, and welcome to another quiet night of boring history for sleep. Tonight we begin by exploring a world of hidden glances and unspoken rules as we answer the question, what was dating actually like in the Victorian era? An open fan placed over the left ear means do not betray our secret. It's a desperate, tiny rebellion, a way to have a private conversation in a crowded room, a form of analog, encrypted messaging in a world without digital privacy. The Industrial Revolution in the 19th century was the final step in the fork's total world domination. For centuries, forks had been expensive, handcrafted items made of silver or gold, accessible only to the wealthy. New manufacturing techniques, particularly the development of silver plating and later stainless steel, meant that forks could be mass-produced cheaply. Suddenly, a matching set of knives, forks, and spoons was within the economic reach of the average middle-class family. The fork was democratized. This era of mass production also led to an explosion of specialized forks, a phenomenon that reached its peak in the Victorian era. The Victorians, with their love of intricate rules and specialized tools for every conceivable task, developed a bewildering array of forks. There were dinner forks, salad forks, fish forks, oyster forks, dessert forks, cake forks, ice cream forks, and even tiny specialized forks for eating berries or pickles. Owning and knowing how to use the correct fork was a key indicator of one's social standing and good taste. The fish fork, for instance, was often specially shaped, sometimes with an extra wide tine, and was developed based on the belief that the silver of a standard fork would react with the fish and impart an unpleasant taste. Whether this was chemically true or not, it created a market for a new, essential piece of silverware. The oyster fork, with its small, three-pronged head, was designed specifically for prying a small mollusk from its shell. Each fork told a story about the food it was meant to eat and the social rituals surrounding it. The way the fork is held also developed its own set of cultural rules and distinctions. In the European or continental style, the fork is held in the left hand, tines down to secure the food while it is cut with the knife in the right hand. The piece of food is then raised to the mouth on the back of the fork. In the American style, after cutting the food, the knife is set down and the fork is switched to the right hand to convey the food to the mouth, tines up. This difference, known as the zigzag method, is a subtle but persistent cultural marker. The origins of the American zigzag style of fork handling likely date back to the colonial era, when the fork was still a newer utensil. The common practice was to use a knife to cut food and a spoon for eating it. When forks arrived, they were initially used, like the knife, to spear and hold food. The habit of switching the utensil to the dominant right hand for the actual eating part simply carried over from the way spoons were used. It's a small, fossilized piece of dining history, preserved in American table manners. Today, the fork is utterly unremarkable. It is one of the most common manufactured objects on the planet. Its presence on our tables is as certain as the plate itself. We learn to use it as children without any awareness of its long and tortured past. It's a perfect example of how innovations, once they become fully integrated into our daily lives, become invisible. The fork's journey from a symbol of sin, vanity, and foreign strangeness to an object of complete and total banality is a testament to the slow, powerful, and often strange currents of cultural change. Reflecting on the fork's history is a strangely humbling exercise. It reminds us that even our most basic assumptions about what is normal or civilized are not timeless truths, but are instead the product of specific historical developments. For centuries, the majority of Europeans would have found our modern use of the fork to be disgusting, ridiculous, or downright evil. It's a quiet lesson in cultural relativity, delivered by a simple, four-tined utensil that we barely even notice is there. The initial rejection of the fork by the clergy, especially by figures like Peter Damian, was rooted in a deep-seated medieval worldview that saw the human body as a direct creation of God. Therefore, the tools God gave it, hands and fingers, were divinely sanctioned for tasks like eating. To introduce an unnatural intermediary was seen as a form of hubris, an attempt to improve upon God's perfect design. This theological argument carried immense weight in a deeply religious society, making the fork's adoption a spiritual and moral battle, not just a practical one. The association of the fork with Italy and the corresponding resistance in places like England and Germany was also tied up in national stereotypes and rivalries. Italy, during the Renaissance, was seen by the more barbaric Northern Europeans as a place of sophisticated, but also decadent and morally ambiguous culture. The fork became a symbol of this Italianate character. To reject the fork was to reject what was perceived as Italian softness and effeminacy, and to affirm a more robust, manly national identity. It was a culture war played out on the dinner table. The role of royal courts in popularizing the fork cannot be overstated. Courts were the trendsetters of their time. When Catherine de' Medici brought the fork to France, it wasn't just about a new way to eat, it was about the performance of status. Using a fork was difficult and required practice. Mastering it was a skill that set the aristocracy apart. It was a form of cultural capital, a piece of specialized knowledge that demonstrated one's refined upbringing and separated the haves from the have-nots in a very visible way. Then there is florography, the language of flowers. A carefully selected bouquet is not a simple gift, it's a letter. A red rose for love, of course, but yellow acacia for a secret love, or a striped carnation for a refusal. Each petal holds a potential meaning. Let's consider the physical object itself. Early forks were often made of precious materials like gold, silver, or rock crystal, and were part of a personal traveling set called a couteau. A wealthy person would carry their own knife, spoon, and perhaps a fork with them when they traveled or dined out. The idea of a host providing cutlery for their guests was a later development. The personal, jewel-like quality of these early forks reinforced their status as luxury items, personal adornments as much as eating utensils. The transition from 2 to 4 tines was a crucial moment of functional evolution. The two-pronged fork is essentially a spear. You can stab a piece of meat with it, but that's about it. The addition of more and slightly curved tines transformed its function. It could now act as a scoop or a shovel, capable of holding loose items like rice or peas. This made it a far more versatile and useful tool, allowing it to eventually replace the spoon for many solid foods, and securing its place as an essential part of the modern cutlery set. The Victorian obsession with specialized forks is a fascinating window into the mindset of that era. It was an age of classification, categorization, and rigid social etiquette. Having a specific fork for every type of food was a way of imposing order on the world and demonstrating one's mastery of a complex social code. It was a form of conspicuous consumption and social signaling. You weren't just eating asparagus. You were demonstrating that you were the kind of person who owned and knew how to use asparagus tongs, a type of serving fork. The hygiene argument for the fork's adoption gained significant traction in the 18th and 19th centuries with the growing understanding of germs and disease transmission. The old style of eating, where multiple people would dip their hands into a common serving bowl, came to be seen as unsanitary and potentially dangerous. The fork offered a way to maintain personal space and hygiene at the dinner table. It was part of a larger sanitary revolution that included things like individual drinking glasses and the separation of private and public spaces. It's also worth noting that in many cultures around the world, the fork never achieved dominance. In much of Asia, chopsticks remained the primary eating utensil, a system of equal antiquity and sophistication. And in many parts of South Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, eating with the right hand remains the traditional and preferred method. The fork's triumph is a distinctly Western story. Its global spread is largely a product of European cultural and colonial influence, not a universal law of dining. The slow, centuries-long adoption of the fork reminds us that cultural change is often a gradual and contested process. It wasn't as if one day a memo went out and everyone started using forks. It was a slow creep, driven by fashion, technology, and shifting ideas about class and cleanliness. For generations, fork users and finger users coexisted, each likely viewing the other's habits with a degree of suspicion or disdain. It was a silent, simmering conflict of table manners. The fork's journey is also a story about the changing relationship between the human body and the world. The shift from eating with hands to eating with a tool represents a move towards creating a barrier, a distance, between our bodies and our food. It's a small but significant step in a larger trend of controlling our more animal impulses and presenting a more refined, controlled version of ourselves to society. The fork is, in a way, a tool for managing our own physicality. Thomas Courtship, the Englishman who was mocked for using a fork, is a fascinating figure. He was an eccentric travel writer and courtier in the court of James I. His willingness to adopt the Italian fork was part of a larger, cosmopolitan outlook. He was a man who was open to foreign ideas and customs in an age of growing nationalism. His personal story makes him a sort of unsung hero of the fork, a pioneer who endured ridicule for the sake of what he saw as a more civilized and clean way of life. The materials used to make forks have their own history. The fear that silver forks would tarnish or taste bad with certain foods like eggs or fish led to the development of specialized forks made from other materials, or silver forks with gold-plated tines, known as vermeil. The invention of stainless steel in the early 20th century was the great equalizer. It was cheap, durable, and didn't react with food, making it the perfect material for mass-market cutlery and finally resolving the old anxieties about taste and tarnish. The fork's relationship with the knife is also a key part of its story. For centuries, the knife was the primary eating utensil. People used the tip of their personal knife to spear pieces of food and bring them to their mouth. The development of the fork allowed the knife to be retired from this duty. This led to a change in knife design. The sharp, pointed tip was no longer needed, and table knives developed the rounded, blunt end that is common today, making them safer and more specialized for just cutting and spreading. A suitor sending you a tussie-mussy, a small, fragrant bouquet, is like sending a carefully crafted, high-stakes text message today. The combination of flowers could convey passion, ask a question, or even issue a gentle warning, all under the guise of a pretty present. Let's think about the spork, that hybrid spoon-fork utensil. It's often seen as a modern, slightly comical invention associated with fast food and school cafeterias. But, in a way, it represents the logical conclusion of the fork's functional evolution. The curving of the tines and the desire to use it for scooping was an attempt to make the fork more spoon-like. The spork simply takes that to its ultimate conclusion, merging the two into a single, utilitarian, if not particularly elegant tool. It's the fork's strange, plastic grandchild. The story of the fork is ultimately a story about us. It reflects our anxieties about religion, our suspicions of foreigners, our desire to display social status, our growing concerns about hygiene, and our capacity to adapt to new technologies. The next time you sit down to eat, take a moment to look at the fork in your hand. It's not just a piece of metal. It's a tiny museum, holding within its simple shape 1,000 years of human history, vanity, and progress. The fork's association with the devil's pitchfork was not just a passing fancy. It tapped into a deep well of medieval symbolism. The pitchfork was a tool used to cast souls into the fires of hell. Its sharp tines represented torment and damnation. To bring a miniature version of this to the holy act of breaking bread was, for some, a terrifying prospect. It was seen as an invitation for evil to enter the home through the seemingly innocent act of eating dinner. Superstition was a powerful force, shaping everyday life in ways we can now barely imagine. When Catherine de' Medici arrived in France, the French court was still eating in a relatively medieval style. The fork was part of a larger, civilizing package she introduced, which also included the use of individual napkins and the separation of sweet and savory courses in a meal. Her influence helped to create the foundations of what we now think of as classical French cuisine and dining etiquette. The fork was a small but crucial part of this culinary revolution. The social pressure to conform to new dining standards in the 18th and 19th centuries must have been immense. Imagine being a member of the rising middle class, invited to dine with a wealthier family for the first time. You would be faced with a bewildering array of silverware, and using the wrong fork for the fish course could be a source of acute social embarrassment, a clear signal that you did not belong. The fork became a gatekeeper, a tool for enforcing social hierarchies. The term dandy, or fop, so often leveled at early fork users, referred to a man who was overly concerned with his appearance and manners. This was seen as an unmanly trait, as a man's worth was supposed to be in his actions, his courage, and his piety, not in the way he ate his peas. The fork, being a tool of delicacy and precision, was seen as part of this world of frivolous feminine concern, a stark contrast to the straightforward, masculine act of eating with one's hands and a knife. The Industrial Revolution didn't just make forks cheaper, it also standardized them. Before mass production, forks were handmade and varied in size and shape. The factory system produced thousands of identical forks, creating a uniform standard for what a dinner fork or a salad fork should look like. This standardization is what allowed for the widespread dissemination of the complex rules of Victorian dining etiquette. Everyone could now buy the same tools and be expected to learn the same rules. Consider the spork's cousin, the splade, a utensil invented in Australia in the 1940s that combines the functions of a spoon, fork, and knife with a sharpened edge. This quest for an all-in-one utensil is a very modern impulse, driven by a desire for efficiency and casualness. It stands in stark contrast to the Victorian impulse for specialization and complexity. The journey from a bewildering array of forks to a single hybrid tool reflects a major shift in our dining culture, from formal to informal. The fork's journey is also a story of resistance to change. For hundreds of years, people were perfectly happy and comfortable eating with their hands. The fork was an unnecessary complication, an awkward and foreign solution to a problem that didn't exist. This resistance is a natural human tendency. We often cling to familiar habits and view new ways of doing things with suspicion. The fork had to overcome centuries of, "This is how we've always done it," to find its place at the table. The role of women like Theodora Ducina and Catherine de' Medici is a recurring theme. As cultural ambassadors through marriage, they were often the agents of change, bringing new customs and technologies from their home cultures to their new ones. While Theodora was punished for her innovation, Catherine was more successful. Their stories highlight the important, and often overlooked, role that women have played in shaping the course of cultural history, even in something as simple as table manners. If a gentleman shows interest, his first move is to request a formal call. This is the Victorian first date. He will visit your home, and you will receive him in the parlor, with your chaperone seated strategically in the room, knitting, but listening to every single word. The final acceptance of the fork in England was partly driven by a desire to emulate the French, who had, by the 18th century, become the arbiters of European taste and fashion. The English aristocracy, while politically rivals of the French, were keen to adopt French manners, language, and dining customs to demonstrate their own sophistication. The fork, once a hated symbol of Italian strangeness, became an acceptable symbol of fashionable French refinement. Its nationality, in a sense, had been upgraded. Let's spare a thought for the humble spoon, the fork's often overlooked sibling. The spoon is a much more ancient and universally accepted utensil. Its shape is intuitive, derived from natural objects like shells or cupped hands. It never faced the kind of theological or cultural resistance the fork did. The spoon was always there, quietly and efficiently doing its job, while its new, pointy companion was busy causing scandals and being accused of consorting with the devil. The story of the fork is, in a way, a hopeful one. It shows that even deeply ingrained cultural norms and prejudices can change over time. What was once seen as sinful and effeminate is now seen as normal and necessary. It's a quiet reminder that our definitions of proper behavior are not set in stone, but are constantly evolving, shaped by the strange and unpredictable currents of history. And what we find strange today may well be the unremarkable norm of tomorrow. The two-pronged design of the earliest forks was directly inherited from their larger kitchen counterparts. These large carving forks were designed to securely hold a piece of meat against a platter. The two sharp tines provided a stable, non-slip grip. When the utensil was miniaturized for personal use, the design was simply scaled down, without much thought for its new, more delicate purpose. The result was a tool that was good at stabbing but little else. A transitional fossil in the evolution of cutlery. The Italian city-states of the Renaissance, like Venice and Florence, were hubs of international trade and cultural exchange. This cosmopolitan environment made them more receptive to new ideas and customs from abroad, such as the Byzantine fork. Their wealth also allowed for a culture of luxury and refinement to flourish, where an elegant, non-essential item like a personal fork could be appreciated for its beauty and the status it conferred. Italy was the perfect incubator for the fork's European journey. The very act of learning to use a fork is a small but significant part of childhood development. It requires fine motor skills and coordination. The transition from eating with hands to using a fork is a milestone in a child's journey towards social integration and growing up. In this way, each of us, as we learn to use a fork, unconsciously reenacted a small part of the larger historical civilizing process that took place over centuries. The breach of promise lawsuit in the Victorian era, which we touched on earlier, has a strange connection to the fork. In a society so obsessed with proper form, the fork was part of the theater of courtship. A shared meal was a key ritual. Knowing the complex rules of cutlery was part of the performance of being a, quote, gentleman or a lady. A failure in this area could be seen as a sign of poor breeding, potentially jeopardizing a match. The fork was a small but sharp tool in the high-stakes game of social evaluation. The fork's journey can be seen as a victory of hygiene over tradition. For centuries, tradition dictated that hands were the proper tools for eating, but as scientific understanding grew, the invisible threat of germs began to outweigh the comfort of tradition. The fork became a tool of public health, a small personal barrier against the grime and bacteria of a shared meal. It was a triumph of rational, scientific thinking over older, more superstitious ways of life. The next time you are at a formal dinner and feel a moment of anxiety about which fork to use, remember that this anxiety is not a personal failing. It is a historical inheritance. It is the faint echo of a time when these choices were deeply meaningful. When the wrong fork could signal social doom, your momentary confusion is the ghost of the Victorian obsession with social order, haunting the modern dinner table. The sheer variety of Victorian forks speaks to an almost comical level of specialization. There were even terrapin forks for eating turtle meat, and mango forks designed to hold the slippery fruit. This hyper-specialization was a way for the newly wealthy industrial class to create and display a new kind of aristocratic culture, one based not on ancient bloodlines, but on the mastery of complex, newly invented rules of etiquette. Conversation is a minefield of forbidden topics. You cannot speak of money, politics in any great detail, or anything remotely personal or emotional. You must stick to safe, neutral subjects: the weather, art, literature, and the sermon from last Sunday. The fork's story ends, as many do, with its own ubiquity making it invisible. It succeeded so completely that we no longer see it. It has become part of the unquestioned background of our lives. This is the ultimate fate of any successful technology or social innovation, to become so normal that it is no longer noticed. The fork's long, strange, and controversial journey ends in the quiet peace of the cutlery drawer. The American zigzag fork method is often seen by Europeans as inefficient and slightly clumsy. This small difference in table manners is a fascinating example of cultural divergence. Two cultures, starting with the same tool, developed slightly different operating systems for it. Neither is inherently better, but each feels completely natural to those who grow up with it, and strangely awkward to outsiders. It's a tiny, recurring reminder of the cultural differences that persist even in a globalized world. The link between the fork and the stiff rough collars of the 16th and 17th centuries is a wonderful example of how different technologies and fashions can interact in unexpected ways. The ruff, a symbol of status, made it physically difficult to eat with one's hands. The fork, another symbol of status, provided a solution. The two status symbols reinforced each other, one creating the problem that the other solved. A neat little feedback loop of aristocratic fashion. When we consider the fork's history, we're really talking about the history of Western dining. It's crucial to remember that this is not a universal story. The chopsticks of East Asia, for example, have a history that is just as long and complex. They represent a parallel evolutionary path in eating technology, one that emphasizes dexterity and the cutting of food into bite-sized pieces in the kitchen, rather than at the table. The fork is not the end point of history. It is just one successful solution among others. The story of St. Peter Damian's condemnation of the Byzantine princess is so vivid and memorable that it likely played a significant role in cementing the fork's negative reputation for centuries. It's a powerful narrative: foreign vanity, divine punishment, a gruesome death. It's the kind of story that would have been repeated in sermons and cautionary tales. A piece of powerful propaganda that effectively killed the fork's prospects in Europe for hundreds of years. The final victory of the fork was sealed when it became associated not just with class, but with morality and good character. By the 19th century, using a fork properly was seen as a sign of a person's self-control, discipline, and refined nature. Not using one was seen as brutish and uncivilized. The fork had completed its journey from a symbol of sin to a symbol of virtue, a remarkable moral rebranding that took the better part of a millennium to achieve. The fork's journey from a tool of the elite to an object for the masses is a classic story of technological diffusion. It follows a predictable pattern: innovation by the wealthy, imitation by the aspirational middle classes, and finally, mass production making it available to everyone. We see this same pattern with countless other technologies, from cars to computers. The fork was just an early and particularly slow-moving example of this process. The modern minimalist trend, which often favors simple, multi-purpose objects, is in direct opposition to the Victorian love of specialization. Today, we might admire a single, beautifully designed spork, or a simple three-piece cutlery set. This rejection of complexity for its own sake is a cultural pendulum swing away from the cluttered and rule-bound world of our great-great-grandparents. The fork's story continues to evolve with our changing values. It's a comforting thought that even in our modern, fast-paced world, we are still connected to this long, strange history every time we sit down for a meal. The simple, unthinking act of picking up a fork ties us to Byzantine princesses, Italian courtiers, mocked English travelers, and anxious Victorian social climbers. History is not just in books. It's in our hands, 3 or 4 times a day. Let's imagine for a moment being at a feast in 14th century England. There are no forks. You have a knife for cutting and a spoon for soups. Everything else is eaten with your fingers. Large bowls of water in towels, called ewers and basins, would be passed around for washing your hands between courses. It was a system that worked perfectly well for centuries. The fork was not an obvious improvement. It was a disruption to a well-established and functional system. The goal is to perform a version of yourself. Poised, witty but not too witty, intelligent but not intimidating. You are both auditioning for a lifelong role, and the stakes could not be higher. One wrong move, one awkward silence, could end the entire prospect. The tactile sensation of eating with one's hands is something that has been largely lost in Western culture. Proponents of the practice, common in many parts of the world, argue that it creates a more direct and intimate connection with one's food. The fork, in this view, is a barrier that dulls the sensory experience of eating. It's a reminder that every technological gain comes with a corresponding, if often unnoticed, loss. The legal and social implications of dining etiquette were very real. In an era when marriages were essentially business mergers between families, a young man or woman's table manners were under intense scrutiny. A faux pas with a fork could be interpreted as a sign of a poor upbringing or a lack of refinement, potentially scuttling a valuable match. The fork was a small but potent weapon in the arsenal of social judgment. The very word fork comes from the Latin furca, which meant pitchfork. This linguistic connection undoubtedly helped to reinforce the association with the devil's instrument. Words have power, and in this case, the name of the tool itself carried with it a set of unfortunate and sinister connotations that took centuries to overcome. It was born with a branding problem. The fork's slow spread can be mapped geographically. It radiates out from Italy, first to France, then to Spain, then to Austria and Germany, and finally, grudgingly, to England and Scandinavia. This pattern follows the main arteries of trade and cultural influence of the time. You can almost trace the flow of Renaissance ideas across Europe by plotting the appearance of the fork in the historical record. The modern, disposable plastic fork is the final, logical endpoint of the fork's journey. It has become so cheap and ubiquitous that it can be used once and then thrown away. From a rare, golden instrument of Byzantine royalty to a piece of plastic garbage in a landfill, the fork's story is also a story about the changing value of objects in our world. It's a journey from priceless to worthless, all while remaining functionally the same. So as you drift off to sleep, perhaps you can spare a final thought for this humble utensil. An object that was once a scandal, a symbol of sin, a marker of class, and a tool of the devil. It fought a long, slow battle for acceptance, and won so completely that we forgot the war was ever fought. It is a true testament to the quiet, relentless power of an idea whose time has come. A silent, four-pronged victor. For our final story tonight, we journey to the turbulent waters of the South China Sea at the turn of the 19th century. This is a world of imperial decay, burgeoning trade, and rampant piracy. And in the center of this chaotic world, we find one of the most successful pirates in all of human history, This pirate commanded a fleet larger than many national navies, created a strict code of laws, and defeated the fleets of the Qing dynasty, the Portuguese, and the British. And this pirate's name was Qing Shi, a woman who rose from the lowest rungs of society to become a powerful and feared pirate queen. Her story begins in the late 1700s in the southern Chinese province of Guangdong. We know very little about her early life, not even her birth name. She first appears in the historical record simply as Shi Yang, a beautiful young woman working as a prostitute on one of the many floating brothels, or flower boats, in the port city of Canton. This was a life of extreme precarity and powerlessness, at the absolute bottom of the social ladder. But she was intelligent, ambitious, and possessed a remarkable talent for observation and strategy, skills she was honing in the complex social world of the flower boat. Her life took a dramatic turn around 1801, when she caught the eye of a man named Zheng Yi, the commander of a formidable pirate fleet known as the Red Flag Fleet. The exact circumstances of their meeting are debated. Some stories say he raided her brothel and was so taken with her that he captured her. Others, more plausibly, suggest that he specifically sought her out, having heard of her intelligence and business acumen, and saw her as a valuable partner. Whatever the case, she did not become his mere captive. She negotiated her own terms. Qing Shi reportedly agreed to marry Zheng Yi on one condition: that she be granted an equal share in the leadership of the fleet and a full say in its command. This was an audacious demand for anyone, let alone a woman from a brothel, but Zheng Yi agreed. He recognized her potential as a strategist and a partner. From that moment on, she was no longer just the commander's wife. She was an active and brilliant pirate leader in her own right, known from then on as Qing Shi, which simply means Zheng's widow. If things progress, you might be allowed to take a walk together, in a public park during the day, with your chaperone trailing a few respectable paces behind. You may not link arms until you are officially engaged. The space between you is a tangible measure of propriety. Together, Qing Shi and Zheng Yi forged a massive pirate confederation. They used their political skill to unite the many rival Cantonese pirate fleets under a single banner, creating an alliance of unprecedented scale and power. By 1805, their Red Flag Fleet was the largest and most powerful of 6 fleets in the Confederation. They controlled vast stretches of the South China Sea, extorting protection money from coastal villages and merchant ships, and effectively running a shadow government on the water. Qing Shi was the mastermind behind much of their organizational and strategic success. Then, in 1807, disaster struck. Zheng Yi was killed, either in a typhoon or in battle. The records are unclear. In the patriarchal world of piracy, the death of the male commander should have meant the dissolution of his fleet or its takeover by a subordinate. Qing Shi, now a 32-year-old widow, was in a precarious position, but she was not about to let her empire crumble. She immediately began a series of brilliant political maneuvers to secure her own power, acting with a speed and ruthlessness that caught all her rivals off guard. Her first and most crucial move was to secure the loyalty of her late husband's second-in-command, a charismatic young fisherman-turned-pirate named Cheng Po Tsai. Cheng Po had been captured by Zheng Yi as a teenager and had become his adopted son and protege. He was a popular and respected commander. Qing Shi quickly entered into a romantic and strategic partnership with him, solidifying his loyalty and ensuring the support of the rank-and-file pirates who admired him. With Cheng Po as her public face and military enforcer, she became the undisputed leader of the Red Flag Fleet. With her power consolidated, Qing Shi set about transforming the Red Flag Fleet from a loose collection of brigands into a highly disciplined quasi-military organization. Her greatest innovation was the implementation of a strict and comprehensive code of laws. This code was not a suggestion, it was absolute, and the punishment for breaking it was swift and severe, usually decapitation. This code of conduct was the foundation of her power and the reason for her fleet's incredible success and longevity. The laws were remarkably detailed. All plunder had to be brought to a common storehouse and registered before it could be distributed. The pirate who captured the goods received 20%, and the remaining 80% went into the public fund, which was used to maintain the ships and support the entire fleet. This system prevented infighting and ensured the collective good over individual greed. Any pirate caught hiding plunder was executed. This created a system of radical, if brutal, fairness that fostered loyalty and discipline. Qing Shi's code was also surprisingly progressive for a pirate when it came to the treatment of female captives. She decreed that any pirate who assaulted a female captive would be put to death. If a pirate wished to take a female captive as his wife, he had to be faithful to her. Unfaithfulness was a capital offense. While the captive women were still prisoners, this code afforded them a level of protection that was unheard of, not just in the pirate world, but in many so-called civilized societies of the time. The code also governed military discipline. A pirate who deserted his post or went ashore without permission would have his ears pierced in public as a humiliation for a first offense. A second offense meant death. The laws were read aloud to every new recruit, and they were strictly and impartially enforced. Qing Shi had created a floating state with its own legal system, bureaucracy, and tax system in the form of protection money. She was not just a pirate, she was the Admiral Queen of a maritime empire. Under her command, the Red Flag Fleet grew to an astonishing size. At its peak, it consisted of over 800 ships and an estimated 80,000 pirates, men, women, and even children. To put that in perspective, this was a larger naval force than many countries in the world possessed at the time. Her fleet was a sprawling, mobile city on the water, capable of overwhelming any opponent through sheer numbers and disciplined tactics. She controlled the entire coast of southern China, and no ship could sail without paying her tribute. The Chinese government under the Qing dynasty was terrified and humiliated by her power. They sent fleet after fleet to destroy her, but Qing Shi outmaneuvered and defeated them every time. Her spies and networks in the coastal villages gave her advance warning of government movements. She used her superior knowledge of the local waterways to trap and decimate the imperial navy. In one famous incident, she cornered the government's fleet and offered the admiral a choice: surrender or be destroyed. He chose to scuttle his own ships and take his own life, rather than face the disgrace of surrendering to a female pirate. Her dominance was so complete that the desperate Chinese government was forced to seek help from foreign powers. They leased ships from the British and enlisted the help of the Portuguese Navy based in Macau. But even this combined force could not defeat Qing Shi. The Red Flag Fleet was too large, too well organized, and too familiar with the local conditions. She fought them to a standstill, further cementing her reputation as an invincible force on the South China Sea. The only place for any real intimacy is in letters. Written correspondence was the vessel for Victorian romance. Here, you could express feelings and thoughts that were impossible to say face to face. But even these were often read by mothers and sisters before being sent. But Qing Shi was a brilliant strategist, and she knew that her reign could not last forever. Governments have long memories and deep resources. Internal rivalries within the pirate confederation were beginning to simmer. She had reached the absolute pinnacle of her power, and she knew that from the top, the only way is down. So, in 1810, at the height of her power, she made her most audacious move yet. She decided to retire. But she was not going to just fade away. She was going to negotiate the terms of her own surrender. She sent an unarmed delegation to the Governor-General of Canton to open negotiations for a general amnesty. The government, weary of years of costly and humiliating defeats, was receptive. However, the negotiations stalled over the government's demand that the pirates surrender on their knees, a symbol of total submission that Qing Shi refused to accept. To break the deadlock, she took an incredible risk. She sailed, alone and unarmed except for a small retinue of women and children, directly to the Governor-General's palace in Canton. This bold and unexpected move completely disarmed the government officials. The Governor-General was so impressed by her courage and audacity that he agreed to her terms. The final amnesty agreement was unprecedented in its generosity. Qing Shi and her pirates would be pardoned for all their crimes. They would be allowed to keep all of their plunder. The men would be allowed to join the Qing military or bureaucracy if they wished. It was less of a surrender and more of a negotiated peace treaty between two equal powers. To seal the deal and save face for the government, the Governor-General presided over a marriage ceremony between Qing Shi and her partner, Cheng Po-tsai. This allowed the government to frame the amnesty as a compassionate act bestowed upon a newly married couple. Chung Po-tsai was given his own command in the Qing Navy and went on to have a successful career as a government official, a pirate hunter fighting his former colleagues. Qing Shi had successfully laundered her entire criminal enterprise into a legitimate, government-sanctioned retirement. And so, at the age of 35, Qing Shi, the most powerful and successful pirate of her age, simply retired. She had achieved what almost no other pirate in history ever has, a peaceful and prosperous old age. She settled back in Canton, the city where she had started as a prostitute, and used her vast fortune to open a gambling house, which some say also functioned as a brothel. She lived out the rest of her days as a wealthy and respected, if somewhat notorious, businesswoman, dying peacefully in her bed in 1844 at the age of 69. Qing Shi's story is remarkable not just for her success, but for her incredible business and political acumen. She was not just a raider, she was a nation builder. She created a stable, well-governed, and profitable organization in one of the most chaotic environments imaginable. Her story completely subverts our stereotypical image of a pirate as a swashbuckling, disorganized rogue. She was a CEO, a legislator, and a Grand Admiral, all rolled into one. Her legacy is a testament to the power of intelligence, organization, and knowing exactly when to quit while you're ahead. The floating brothels, or flower boats, of Canton were a unique and complex social institution. While the women who worked on them were exploited, the environment also required them to develop sharp skills in negotiation, financial management, and reading people. It was a competitive and often dangerous world. The skills Qing Shi learned there, managing clients, handling money, and navigating complex power dynamics, were directly transferable to the world of piracy. Her time on the flower boat was, in a strange way, an apprenticeship for her future career as a pirate queen. The Red Flag Fleet was just one of 6 major pirate fleets that formed the Confederation. The others were the black, white, blue, yellow, and green flag fleets. Each had its own commander and territory. Qing Shi and Jing Yi's genius was in convincing these rivals that cooperation was more profitable than competition. They created a Grand Council of Commanders to coordinate their activities. However, this alliance was always fragile, and managing the egos and ambitions of the other pirate lords was a constant challenge for Qing Shi, a major factor in her decision to seek amnesty. Qing Po-tsai, Qing Shi's partner and adopted son of her late husband, is a fascinating figure in his own right. He was a fisherman's son who rose to become a fearsome pirate commander. His charisma and popularity with the common pirates were a perfect complement to Qing Shi's strategic mind. Their partnership was a powerful combination of brains and brawn. After the amnesty, he successfully transitioned to a government official, a classic example of poacher turned gamekeeper. There is still a cave on Chung Chau Island in Hong Kong named after him, where he supposedly stored his treasure. The scale of the Red Flag Fleet's extortion racket was immense. It was known as the tanka system. They would issue any ship or coastal village in their territory a pass or a flag. If a vessel was caught without this pass, its cargo and crew were seized. It was a highly organized system of taxation that provided a steady and reliable income stream, making the fleet less reliant on the unpredictable profits of raiding. This financial stability was a key element of Qing Shi's success, allowing her to maintain her massive fleet. Throughout this entire process, your families are performing a ruthless background check. His financial prospects, your family's social standing, the health of your respective bloodlines, all are being weighed and measured. It's a merger, not just a marriage. The Qing government's weakness at the time was a major contributing factor to the rise of piracy. The dynasty was in a period of decline, plagued by internal corruption and rebellion. The imperial navy was underfunded, poorly led, and demoralized. This power vacuum on the seas created the perfect opportunity for figures like Qing Shi to flourish. She didn't just fight the navy, she exploited the fundamental weaknesses of the state itself. Her pirate empire was a symptom of a failing imperial system. The act of decapitation as the standard punishment in Qing Shi's code was not arbitrary. It was a common form of capital punishment in China at the time and carried a powerful psychological weight. It was a clear and unambiguous message that indiscipline would not be tolerated. The public nature of the punishments, often carried out in front of the entire crew, served to reinforce the law and instill a culture of fear and obedience, which was essential for controlling a population of tens of thousands of hardened criminals. Qing Shi's solo trip to the Governor General's palace is the stuff of legend. But it was a calculated risk, not a reckless one. She understood the psychology of power. By appearing before him as an unarmed woman, she was subverting his expectations and appealing to his sense of honor and magnanimity. She was performing a role, just as she had on the flower boat. It was a masterful piece of political theater, designed to give the official an honorable way to accept her terms without looking weak. The fact that Qing Shi was allowed to keep her plunder is perhaps the most stunning part of the amnesty deal. Pirate amnesty was not uncommon, but it usually required the pirates to give up their ill-gotten gains. The government's willingness to let her walk away with her fortune is the ultimate proof of her power. They were so desperate to get her fleet off the water that they were willing to pay an enormous price. She effectively negotiated the largest golden parachute in the history of piracy. The gambling house she opened in her retirement was a canny business move. It was a cash-based business, perfect for laundering her vast pirate fortune. It also kept her connected to the underworld and the flow of information in Canton. She didn't just retire, she transitioned into a different, more legitimate kind of racketeering. She never truly left the life of strategy and power. She just changed the venue from the deck of a ship to the back room of a casino. It's important to contrast Qing Shi with her Western counterparts, like Blackbeard or Calico Jack. While they are more famous in the West, their careers were short, their fleets were small, and they all met violent ends. Blackbeard commanded a few ships and a few hundred men for a couple of years. Qing Shi commanded over 1,000 ships and tens of thousands of men for a decade, defeated multiple national navies, and died of old age as a wealthy woman. By any objective measure, she was in a league of her own. The historical sources for Qing Shi's life are primarily from Qing government records and the accounts of Richard Glasspool, an English merchant sailor who was captured by the Red Flag fleet and held for several months. His detailed account, quote, "A wonderful and tragical relation," provides a rare European eyewitness perspective on the inner workings of her pirate empire, including her code of laws and the scale of her operations. It is one of the key documents that confirms her incredible story. The geography of the Pearl River Delta was crucial to her success. It is a complex network of islands, hidden coves, and shallow waterways. This labyrinthine environment was a pirate's paradise. It provided endless places to hide, repair ships, and ambush larger, less maneuverable government vessels. Qing Shi and her pirates knew this terrain intimately, giving them a home field advantage that the Imperial Navy, often staffed by officers from northern China, could not match. The ships used by the Red Flag fleet were primarily junks, the traditional Chinese sailing vessel. These ships were highly versatile, with their distinctive battened sails making them easy to handle and efficient in various wind conditions. They ranged in size from small coastal raiders to large, ocean-going vessels that could carry hundreds of men and dozens of cannons. The fleet was a diverse mix of ship types, adapted for the various tasks of raiding, transport, and naval combat. The story of Qing Shi challenges our gender stereotypes about history. In most historical narratives, women are relegated to the sidelines. Qing Shi's story is a powerful counterexample. She was not just a participant. She was the central commanding figure in one of the great criminal enterprises of her time. Her success was not due to her beauty, but to her intellect, her ruthlessness, and her strategic genius. She demonstrates that power and ambition are not exclusively male traits. The proposal itself is rarely a surprise. It is a carefully orchestrated event, often coming after the gentleman has already formally asked your father for your hand. It's the final step in a long, public negotiation, a confirmation of a deal already struck. The end of Qing Shi's pirate career coincided with a changing world. The growing presence of European naval power in the South China Sea and the impending Opium Wars would have made the old style of piracy increasingly difficult in the coming decades. Her decision to retire in 1810 was incredibly prescient. She got out at the perfect time, just before the game changed for good. This sense of timing, of knowing when to fold her hand, was perhaps her greatest skill of all. Qing Shi's code regarding female captives is remarkable because it established a rule of law in an area where lawlessness was the norm. While her motives may have been pragmatic, preventing infighting and maintaining discipline, the effect was to create a safer environment for these women than they might have found elsewhere. It's a complex and morally gray area, but it shows a level of organizational thinking that went far beyond simple plunder. After the amnesty, the Qing government used the surrendered pirates of the Red Flag Fleet to hunt down the other pirate fleets that had not accepted the deal. This divide-and-conquer strategy was brutally effective. Chung Putsai, now a naval commander, used his intimate knowledge of pirate tactics and hideouts to crush his former rivals. Cheng Shi's decision to take the amnesty not only saved her own fleet, but also hastened the end of the entire golden age of South China piracy. The population of the Red Flag Fleet was not just made up of hardened criminals. It included entire families. Wives and children lived on the larger ships. The fleet also included a vast support network of artisans, doctors, shipwrights, and merchants who supplied the pirates. It was a complete society at sea, a floating world with its own economy and social structure, all presided over by Qing Shi. The story of Qing Shi has seen a resurgence in popular culture, appearing in books, television shows, and video games. She is often portrayed as a feminist icon, a woman who shattered the glass ceiling of her time in the most dramatic way possible. While this is a modern interpretation, it's rooted in the undeniable truth of her accomplishments. She built an empire in a man's world and then walked away on her own terms. Her transition from a prostitute to a pirate leader is a story of incredible social mobility. In the rigid, hierarchical society of Qing China, such a leap was virtually impossible. The world of piracy, for all its brutality, was a rare meritocracy. It was a world where ability, cunning, and ruthlessness mattered more than birth or social standing. Qing Shi exploited this alternative social ladder to climb higher than anyone could have ever imagined. The legacy of piracy in the South China Sea did not end with Qing Shi. The region has remained a hotspot for piracy well into the 21st century. However, the modern pirates with their small speedboats and automatic weapons are a far cry from the grand, organized fleets of the early 19th century. Qing Shi represents the absolute apex of the profession, a scale of operation that has never been equaled. The failure of the combined Portuguese and British forces to defeat her is a testament to her fleet's power. The European navies had superior ship technology and gunnery, but they were defeated by local knowledge, superior numbers, and clever tactics. Qing Shi proved that technology is not always the deciding factor in a conflict. She used her low-tech but highly effective fleet to fight the world's most advanced navies to a draw. The fact that her birth name is lost to history is a poignant detail. The name she is known by, Qing Shi, simply means widow of Zheng. It defines her in relation to her husband. It is a deeply ironic name for a woman whose accomplishments so completely overshadowed his. She forged her own legend, but history remembers her through the filter of the man she first married. A final, small injustice in a life of incredible triumphs. The financial organization of the Red Flag Fleet was key to its stability. The central treasury and the fixed 80/20th split of plunder created a system that was seen as fair and reliable by the pirates. This prevented the kind of disputes over loot that tore many other pirate crews apart. Qing Shi understood that a successful criminal enterprise needs a good accounting department as much as it needs cannons. She was as much a CFO as a CEO. So, before you get too comfortable, take just a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It's a quiet and simple way to support the channel. This rigid, almost painful system wasn't born from a lack of feeling, but from an excess of anxiety. In a world changing so rapidly, these rules provided a sense of order and control, a way to navigate the terrifying prospect of choosing a partner for life. The image of Qing Shi, a former prostitute, dictating terms to the representative of the emperor, is one of the great power reversals in history. It is a moment where the entire social order is turned upside down. The powerless woman from the bottom of society stands before the powerful man from the top, and she is the one with the leverage. It is the culmination of a life spent defying every expectation and breaking every rule. The story of Qing Shi is ultimately a business story. She identified a market, the vulnerable shipping lanes of South China, consolidated her competition, the other pirate fleets, established a strong corporate structure, the code of laws, and then, when the market conditions were about to change, she executed a perfect exit strategy, the amnesty. It's a brutal, bloody, but brilliant case study in building and then cashing out an empire. One of the most common pirate tactics was the wolfpack attack. A large group of junks would surround a target vessel, overwhelming it from all sides with cannon fire and grappling hooks. The sheer number of attackers would demoralize the crew of the merchant ship, often leading to a quick surrender. It was a tactic that relied on numbers and coordination, two things Qingxi's fleet had in abundance. The psychological impact of the Red Flag fleet on the coastal population must have been immense. For the common people, the pirates were both a terror and, at times, a symbol of defiance against a corrupt and ineffective government. Some villagers willingly collaborated with the pirates, providing them with supplies and intelligence in exchange for protection or a share of the profits. Qingxi's power was built not just on fear, but on a complex web of local alliances. Zheng Potsai's post-pirate career was remarkably successful. He was given a comfortable government position and tasked with suppressing the remaining pirates. His knowledge of their methods made him exceptionally good at his job. It's a classic story of the state co-opting a powerful threat by bringing it into the system. The government couldn't beat him, so they hired him, a pragmatic solution that brought a period of relative peace to the coast. The story of Qingxi serves as a powerful reminder that history is full of incredible figures who are often overlooked by mainstream Western narratives. Her story is as epic and dramatic as that of any European monarch or general, yet she remains relatively unknown outside of Asia. Exploring these hidden histories enriches our understanding of the past and challenges our assumptions about who gets to be a major historical figure. The amnesty agreement was a masterpiece of negotiation. Qingxi secured not just a pardon and her fortune, but also government jobs for her men. This was crucial as it gave thousands of unemployed pirates a new purpose and prevented them from simply returning to a life of crime. It was a comprehensive solution that addressed the long-term problem, demonstrating her foresight and her genuine concern for the welfare of her crews. The Red Flag Fleet's treasury was likely a combination of silver, gold, spices, silk, and other valuable trade goods. The logistics of managing such a vast and diverse treasure, constantly moving it and protecting it from internal and external threats, would have been a monumental task. This logistical challenge, as much as the military ones, speaks to the incredible organizational capacity of Qingxi's operation. The role of women within the pirate fleet, beyond Qingxi herself, is a fascinating area of speculation. While the code protected female captives, many women were active participants in the pirate life, working alongside the men. Piracy offered a strange form of liberation from the rigid gender roles of mainstream Chinese society. On a pirate ship, your usefulness was what mattered most, not your gender. The legacy of the Red Flag Fleet can still be seen in the folklore and place names of the Hong Kong and Guangdong region. Stories of pirate battles and hidden treasures abound. Qingxi and Zheng Potsai have become legendary, almost mythical figures, their real-life accomplishments blending with centuries of storytelling to create a powerful local legend that endures to this day. And now, let's leave the stuffy parlors of Victorian England and travel to the vast, sunburnt plains of Western Australia in 1932. Here we find a story not of romantic anxiety, but of a bizarre conflict that pitted man against bird in a battle for the ages, the Great Emu War. After the First World War, the Australian government, in a gesture of gratitude and nation-building, settled thousands of veterans on marginal farmland. They were promised a new life, a chance to tame the land and build a future, but the land and the economy had other plans. The Great Depression hit, wheat prices plummeted, and a severe drought was desiccating the landscape, forcing all living things to search desperately for water and sustenance. And that's when the emus arrived. The decision to retire was an act of supreme self-awareness. Many powerful leaders, both criminal and legitimate, are undone by their inability to recognize when their power has peaked. They cling on for too long and are eventually overthrown. Qingxi's genius was in her ability to see the writing on the wall and to choose her own ending, a rare and remarkable feat for anyone who has reached the pinnacle of power. The fact that she chose to open a gambling house is a perfect final chapter. Gambling, like piracy, is a business of risk, strategy, and understanding human nature. She simply moved from one high-stakes table to another. It was a life that allowed her to continue using the skills she had honed over a lifetime, but without the constant threat of being blown out of the water by a government cannonball. Qing Shi's story is a powerful illustration of the idea that history is often made by those who live on the margins. She was a woman, a prostitute, and a criminal, three of the most marginalized identities in her society. Yet from this position of extreme disadvantage, she built an empire that challenged the state itself. Her life is a testament to the fact that power can emerge from the most unexpected of places. The Qing government's official records, while a valuable source, likely downplay the extent of their humiliation. They would have framed the amnesty as an act of imperial mercy rather than a negotiated settlement with a superior foe. Reading between the lines of these official accounts allows us to see the true scale of Qing Shi's power and the desperation of the government she so thoroughly outmaneuvered. Let us imagine the sheer spectacle of the red flag fleet at anchor. A forest of over 1,000 masts, stretching as far as the eye can see. The air filled with the sounds of tens of thousands of people. The smell of cooking fires and gunpowder. It was not just a fleet, it was a floating city, a nation unto itself, all under the command of one woman. It's a breathtaking image of a forgotten maritime empire. The failure of the European powers to defeat her is a crucial part of the story. It shatters the myth of inevitable European military superiority in this era. The British and Portuguese navies were the most powerful in the world, yet they were fought to a standstill by a regional pirate fleet. It's a humbling reminder that local knowledge, clever strategy, and overwhelming numbers can be more than a match for technological advantages. Her partnership with Sheng Puozai was a true power couple. She had the strategic mind and the political cunning. He had the charisma and the loyalty of the fighting men. Together, they were a complete leadership package. Their relationship, both personal and professional, was the engine that drove the Red Flag fleet to its greatest heights. It was a partnership built on mutual respect and a shared ambition for power. The story of Qing Shi is, in the end, a story about control. She took control of her own destiny when she negotiated her marriage. She took control of the pirate world when she implemented her code of laws. She controlled the South China Sea for a decade. And finally, she took control of her own legacy by engineering a peaceful and prosperous retirement. In a world designed to render her powerless, she achieved total control. The brutality of her code cannot be ignored. While it was fair in its own way, it was also merciless. Decapitation was a common punishment. This ruthless streak was likely essential for maintaining order among a massive crew of violent criminals. Her story is not a simple romance. It is a complex and often brutal tale of power, where maintaining control required a will of iron and a willingness to enforce it without mercy. The final image of her, an old woman running a successful, if shady, business in Canton, is a profoundly satisfying conclusion to her epic life. She beat the system, took her winnings, and walked away from the table. She out-pirated the pirates, out-generaled the generals, and out-negotiated the politicians. It's a quiet, comfortable ending to one of the most violent and spectacular careers in maritime history. It wasn't just a few emus. It was, by official estimates, a cohort of around 20,000. These large, flightless birds, driven by the drought from the interior, discovered a veritable paradise in the newly cultivated wheat fields of the ex-soldiers. They were a force of nature, a feathered, long-legged plague that descended upon the crops. Emus, it turns out, are not delicate eaters. They trampled fences, flattened swaths of wheat, and ate their fill, leaving devastation in their wake. The farmers, many of whom were decorated soldiers, found themselves fighting a new and deeply frustrating war on the home front. They were losing, and their livelihoods were being pecked and trampled into dust. Desperate, they appealed to the government for help. Her story is a testament to the power of organization. The other pirate fleets were just gangs. The Red Flag Fleet was an army, a corporation, and a government. This focus on structure, rules, and logistics is what set her apart. She understood that true, lasting power comes not just from force, but from creating a system that can sustain and direct that force effectively. She was a systems builder, not just a raider. The contrast between her beginning and her end is staggering. From a nameless girl on a floating brothel to a wealthy, respected, and feared matriarch, her life's trajectory is almost unbelievable. It serves as a powerful, if extreme, example of human potential and the ability of a single individual to reshape their world through sheer force of will and intelligence. As we conclude her story, we are left with the image of a woman who was a true master of the game. She understood the rules better than anyone else, and when the rules didn't suit her, she simply wrote new ones. She was a survivor, a strategist, a leader, and ultimately, a winner in the most dangerous game of them all. A true pirate queen, whose forgotten legacy deserves to be remembered. And so our journey through the quiet corridors of history comes to a close for tonight. We've navigated the rigid rules of Victorian courtship, witnessed the absurd defeat of a modern army by a flock of birds, traced the scandalous rise of the humble fork, and sailed the high seas with the most successful pirate queen of all time. Each story is a small thread in the vast, intricate tapestry of the past. It's a reminder that beneath the surface of the mundane, and within the pages of the forgotten, lie tales of incredible struggle, bizarre comedy, and astonishing triumph. These are the stories that shaped our world in ways both large and small, and they continue to echo softly in the background of our lives. They are proof that history is not just a collection of dates and facts, but a rich and deeply human story. Now, there are no more stories to tell tonight. It's time to let go of these thoughts and allow your mind to drift. Let the gentle weight of these tales anchor you in a place of deep and restful quiet. I hope tonight's journey has been a soothing companion as you make your way towards sleep. Thank you for listening. Rest well and have a very good night. Nourishun, Lipsa. Narachun, Lipsa. The farmers, being veterans, had a unique idea. They knew the destructive power of modern weaponry and requested the deployment of machine guns. The Minister of Defense, Sir George Pearce, himself a senator for Western Australia, was sympathetic. He saw a strange opportunity here. It could be good target practice for the gunners. It would be a decisive show of government support, and, as a bonus, a newsreel cinematographer was sent along to capture what was assumed would be a glorious victory for propaganda purposes. So, in November 1932, a small military contingent was dispatched. It consisted of Major G.P.W. Meredith of the Royal Australian Artillery, accompanied by 2 soldiers armed with 2 Lewis automatic machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. Their mission: to wage war on the emu population. The first attempted battle took place near the town of Campion. The soldiers spotted a flock of about 50 emus. This, they thought, would be easy. They set up the machine guns, the cinematographer readied his camera, and local farmers tried to herd the birds into a neat, tidy kill zone. The emus, however, had no interest in military formations. As soon as the guns opened fire, the large flock didn't panic in a predictable way. Instead, they scattered into numerous small groups, running erratically in all directions, making them incredibly difficult targets. The Lewis guns, designed for static trench warfare, were simply not suited for tracking fast, unpredictable birds across open terrain. After firing a huge number of rounds, the official casualty count was perhaps a dozen emus. The rest had vanished. A few days later, Major Meredith and his men tried a new tactic. They located a flock of over 1,000 emus near a local dam. This time, they would ambush them. They set up the machine gun on a concealed truck and waited. Surely, with this density of targets, they couldn't miss. The emus came within range, and the gunner opened fire. For a moment, it seemed to be working, but then the gun jammed. By the time the soldiers had cleared the stoppage, the emus had once again melted away into the landscape, leaving only a handful of their comrades behind. Major Meredith was beginning to realize that his opponents were far more formidable than he had anticipated. The birds, he noted in his report, seemed to have an uncanny ability to withstand bullets. The press began to catch on to the story, and the tone was not one of admiration. The image of the Australian military, armed with machine guns, being outsmarted by a population of giant, flightless birds was simply too absurd to ignore. One ornithologist famously commented that the military's command structure was no match for the emus' tactics. Each large flock, he noted, seemed to have a leader, a large black-plumed bird that would keep watch while the others ate. At the first sign of danger, this leader would give a warning cry, and the flock would scatter, having already inflicted maximum damage. The emus, it was Riley suggested, had adopted guerrilla tactics, and each emu was like a tank, able to absorb incredible punishment and keep going. Major Meredith, a professional soldier, was growing increasingly frustrated. He and his men were being humiliated. They tried mounting one of the Lewis guns on a truck to give chase, but the plan was a comical failure. The truck couldn't keep up with the birds over the rough terrain, and the ride was so bumpy that the gunner couldn't aim a single shot. The truck ended up crashing through a farmer's fence, causing more damage than the emus had in that particular area. After nearly a week of this farce, having used over 2,500 rounds of ammunition to kill a paltry number of birds, some estimates are as low as 50, though the army claimed a few hundred, the first deployment was called off. The military withdrew, but the emu problem did not. The birds continued their campaign of agricultural destruction, and the farmers, now desperate and facing financial ruin, once again pleaded for military aid. Despite the public ridicule and the clear failure of the first attempt, the Minister of Defense authorized a second expedition. Major Meredith, a man of incredible persistence, was sent back into the field. This time, he claimed, he would be more successful. He had learned from his mistakes, and he was determined to vindicate himself and the Australian military. The Second War began in mid-November 1932, with a renewed, if perhaps misplaced, sense of optimism. This second campaign saw marginally more success, but only in the sense that a complete disaster was upgraded to a mere failure. Over the next month, Major Meredith and his team roamed the wheat belt. They were more careful, more strategic, but the fundamental problem remained. Emus are not good soldiers. They don't march in straight lines, they don't hold territory, and they are remarkably resilient. The army claimed to have killed 986 emus with just under 10,000 rounds, a kill-to-cartridge ratio that was still laughably inefficient. It was becoming clear that waging a conventional war against a force of nature was a fundamentally flawed premise. The cost in ammunition alone was far outweighing the value of the wheat being saved. And as always, I love to see how far these stories travel. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight. It's wonderful to imagine our small community, scattered across the quiet corners of the world. By December, the campaign was officially over. Major Meredith submitted his final report, concluding that the operation had been a success, a claim that was met with widespread skepticism. He praised his men's efforts but was forced to admit the unique challenges posed by the enemy. He wrote, "If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world." It was a backhanded compliment to his feathered adversaries, and a tacit admission of defeat. The Great Emu War had ended not with a bang, but with the quiet withdrawal of a befuddled military, leaving the emus as the undisputed masters of the battlefield. The aftermath was a mix of political fallout and national humor. The story was reported around the world, solidifying the image of Australia as a strange and wonderful place where the army loses wars to birds. The government, for its part, decided that military intervention was not the answer. Instead, they turned to a more practical, if less dramatic, solution. A bounty system was put in place, encouraging farmers and hunters to cull the birds themselves. Over the next few years, tens of thousands of emu bounties were claimed, which proved to be a far more effective method of population control than machine guns had ever been. The ultimate victory, however, was not one of culling but of engineering. The government eventually provided funding for the construction of robust, emu-proof barrier fences. This simple, ancient technology, the fence, succeeded where modern automatic weapons had failed. By physically excluding the birds from the cropping areas, the problem was finally brought under control. It was a humbling lesson in finding the right tool for the job. Sometimes, a well-built fence is mightier than a machine gun, especially when your enemy is a 6-foot-tall bird with a brain the size of a walnut and an unshakable will to survive. The Great Emu War remains a beloved, absurd footnote in Australian history. It serves as a perfect cautionary tale about human hubris. It's a reminder that we often overestimate the power of our technology and underestimate the resilience of the natural world. The image of soldiers fighting a losing battle against a scattered, disorganized, yet ultimately triumphant flock of birds is a powerful symbol. It speaks to the futility of trying to impose rigid, human-made order on the beautiful chaos of nature. And it remains, perhaps, the only war in modern history where one side ate the battlefield and then simply wandered off, completely indifferent to its supposed defeat, leaving the victors to repair their own fences. The two Lewis guns used in the conflict were light machine guns of British design, famously used during World War I. They were air-cooled, which meant they could overheat with sustained fire, and fed ammunition from a distinctive top-mounted pan magazine. While devastatingly effective against human targets in the static, confined spaces of trench warfare, they were woefully ill-suited for the open plains of Australia and the erratic movements of the emus. The gun's rate of fire, around 500 rounds per minute, was wasted when the targets would scatter at the first shot, offering no dense concentration to fire into. The terrain of the Western Australian wheat belt was a significant factor in the emu's success. It's a vast, semi-arid landscape characterized by flat plains interspersed with scrubland and patches of hardy vegetation. This provided the emus with ample cover. They could easily disappear into the bush, breaking line of sight and making pursuit impossible. The unpaved roads and rough ground also made it impossible for the military's trucks to effectively chase the birds, turning any attempt at a mobile assault into a slow, bumpy, and ultimately comical exercise in frustration for Major Meredith and his men. The political context of the Great Depression is crucial to understanding why the war happened at all. The government was under immense pressure to be seen as doing something to help the struggling farmers. The veterans-turned-farmers were a powerful and sympathetic political lobby. Sending in the military was, in many ways, a piece of political theater, a dramatic, visible gesture of support. The hope was that it would be a quick, clean success story that could be used as propaganda. The fact that it backfired so spectacularly turned it from a political asset into a public relations embarrassment for the Minister of Defense. The newsreel cinematographer who accompanied the expedition, a man named Huey D.G. Incamp from Fox Movietone, played an unwitting role in the affair's legacy. His purpose was to capture heroic footage of Australian soldiers protecting the nation's food supply. Instead, he captured scenes of utter futility. His film showed the machine guns blazing away at distant, scattering specks, and the general chaos of the failed operations. This visual evidence made the story undeniable and contributed significantly to the media's gleefully mocking coverage, ensuring the story would be remembered not as a serious military operation, but as a national joke. One of the most fascinating aspects of the emu's defense was their apparent lack of a centralized command structure, which ironically made them harder to defeat. A conventional army has leaders and supply lines that can be targeted. The emus were a decentralized network. If one group was attacked, others nearby were unaffected and continued their feasting. As Major Meredith lamented, they were like Zulu warriors, splitting into countless small units and making it impossible to deliver a decisive blow. This disorganization was, in fact, their greatest strategic strength against a military trained to fight organized enemies. The legacy of the Great Emu War extends into Australian culture. The term Emu War is now a common piece of slang, used to refer to any futile, poorly planned endeavor destined for failure. It's a shorthand for a situation where overwhelming force is applied to a problem in a clumsy and ineffective way. The story is taught in schools, often as a lighthearted and humorous episode, but it carries that deeper lesson about respecting the environment and the limits of human power. It's a shared cultural touchstone that brings a wry smile to the faces of Australians. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan, or pull your favorite blanket a little closer. Let go of the day's worries, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Starting in a time of great restraint, the bounty system that replaced the military intervention was brutally effective, but it also highlights the darker side of the story. Between 1934 and 1945, bounties were paid on over 57,000 emus. This mass culling, carried out by civilians, had a significant impact on the emu population in the region. While the story is often told for laughs, it's rooted in a real conflict between human settlement and native wildlife, a conflict that continues in different forms all over the world. The war was just the most absurd chapter in a much longer and more complicated story of coexistence and competition. Major G.P.W. Meredith himself remains a somewhat tragicomic figure in the tale. He was a career soldier, tasked with an impossible and ridiculous mission. He approached it with the seriousness and professionalism he would have applied to any military command, which only served to heighten the absurdity. His detailed reports, which read like dispatches from a real war, are historical treasures of unintentional comedy. He never lived down the association with the war, a strange and frustrating footnote on what was otherwise a respectable military career. He was the general who was out General E.D. by birds. The emu, Dromaeus novaholandia, is the second largest living bird by height after its relative, the ostrich. Its long, powerful legs allow it to travel great distances and sprint at speeds of up to 30 miles per hour. This speed, combined with its erratic running patterns, was a key defensive asset against the machine gunners. The bird's shaggy brown plumage also provided excellent camouflage in the dry scrubland of Western Australia, allowing them to seemingly vanish into the landscape when they weren't standing in the middle of a vibrant green wheat field. They were, in essence, perfectly adapted to their environment in a way the soldiers were not. There's a subtle irony in the fact that the emu is featured on the Australian coat of arms, alongside the kangaroo. These animals were chosen because they are two native creatures that, it is popularly claimed, cannot easily move backward and were therefore symbolic of a nation always moving forward. During the Great Emu War, however, the emus proved to be exceptionally good at moving forward, right through fences and into crops, much to the dismay of the very nation that had elevated the bird to a position of national symbolism. It was a case of the symbol quite literally biting the hand that feeds it. In the years following the war, the relationship between farmers and emus in the region settled into a tense but more stable equilibrium. The exclusion fences proved to be the most lasting and effective measure. These fences, often subsidized by the government, created clear boundaries that protected the agricultural lands. While emu culling still occurs in some areas to manage populations, the idea of calling in the military to handle the problem would now be seen as utterly preposterous, a lesson learned the hard and very public way back in 1932. The story also serves as a strange and early example of what we might now call asymmetric warfare. It was a conflict between a technologically superior, state-sponsored force and a non-state, low-tech, and highly mobile opponent. The military had overwhelming firepower, but it was useless without a viable target. The emus, with their decentralized structure and superior knowledge of the terrain, were able to neutralize the army's primary advantage simply by refusing to fight the war on the army's terms. They didn't need to win, they just needed to not lose, and they accomplished that beautifully. The cost of the ammunition alone was a point of contention. The 10,000 rounds of .303 ammunition supplied for the first deployment were not cheap, especially during the Great Depression. The fact that so many rounds were expended for so few confirmed kills made the entire operation a clear financial loss for the government. Critics in Parliament were quick to point out that it would have been cheaper to simply pay the farmers for their lost wheat than to fund the farcical military expedition, a point that was hard to argue with. The psychological impact on the soldiers involved shouldn't be entirely dismissed. While the story is funny in retrospect, for Major Meredith and his two men, it was likely a period of intense frustration and public humiliation. They were trained for serious combat, to face human enemies, and were instead tasked with a mission that was impossible to execute cleanly and exposed them to ridicule. It's a strange kind of battlefield stress, the stress that comes from complete and utter absurdity in the face of your professional training and duty. The global reaction to the Emu War was one of bemused fascination. A conservationist group in the United Kingdom, for instance, protested the culling, calling the emus rare, and the war an extermination of the rare emu. This was, of course, factually incorrect, as the emu population was massive and not at all endangered. But it added another layer of international comedy to the affair, with Australians having to defend their war against what they saw as a pest from well-meaning but ill-informed foreigners who pictured the emu as a precious, delicate creature. Ultimately, the Great Emu War is a story about perspective. From the farmer's point of view, it was a desperate struggle for survival against a destructive pest. From the government's perspective, it was a political maneuver that went horribly wrong. From the media's perspective, it was a goldmine of comedic content. And from the emu's perspective, it was probably just a confusing and noisy interruption to a particularly good meal. And in the end, their perspective is the one that mattered most on the sun-scorched fields of Western Australia. Imagine for a moment that you exist in the Victorian world. It's a place of immense progress and stifling social architecture. Here, what we call dating doesn't exist. Instead, there is only courtship, a highly structured, public, and goal-oriented process. The soldier settlement schemes that led to this situation were part of a wider post-World War I trend in countries like Australia, Canada, and the UK. The idea was to reward returning soldiers with land and a chance at a new life. However, these schemes were often poorly planned. The land given was frequently marginal and unsuitable for the kind of farming the veterans were expected to undertake, many of whom had no prior agricultural experience. The Emu War was, in this context, a symptom of a much larger policy failure. The emu's diet normally consists of a wide variety of native plants, seeds, fruits, and insects. Their migration patterns are dictated by rainfall. The creation of large, artificially irrigated wheat fields created an unnatural and irresistible beacon for them during a time of severe drought. It was an all-you-can-eat buffet in the middle of a desert. The conflict was, therefore, an entirely man-made problem, a direct consequence of altering the landscape without fully understanding the ecological repercussions. The emus were not malicious. They were simply acting on instinct. The Lewis gun itself had a reputation for being somewhat unreliable in dusty conditions, which were prevalent in the Australian outback. The intricate mechanism of the pan magazine and the cooling system could easily become clogged with sand and dirt, leading to the kind of jamming that plagued the soldiers during the ambush at the dam. It was another case of the wrong technology being deployed in the wrong environment, a recurring theme in this entire ill-fated chapter of military history. It's interesting to contrast the Emu War with other, more successful pest control campaigns in Australia, such as the War on the Prickly Pear Cactus. In the 1920s, the prickly pear had infested millions of acres of land in Queensland and New South Wales. The solution was not physical removal, but biological control. The introduction of the Cactoblastus cactorum moth, whose larvae devoured the cactus. It was a stunning success. This highlights the lesson that sometimes the most effective solutions are subtle and ecological, not blunt and military. The farmers' initial requests were not just for military hardware, but for military personnel, because they believed trained machine gunners would be more effective. This assumption proved to be spectacularly wrong. It turned out that a local farmer with a simple shotgun, patience, and knowledge of the local terrain and emu behavior could be far more deadly than a soldier with a rapid-fire weapon. This speaks to the value of local, specialized knowledge over generalized, brute force solutions. There are no official monuments to the Great Emu War, for obvious reasons. Its legacy is not cast in bronze or stone, but in stories, jokes, and internet memes. In the 21st century, the story has had a major resurgence in popularity online, becoming a favorite topic for history enthusiasts and comedians alike. It's a piece of history that is perfectly suited to the modern age of irony and absurd humor, a testament to its enduring, if unintentional, entertainment value. The emu population in Australia remains healthy and widespread today. They are a common sight in rural areas and are a protected native species. While they can still come into conflict with agriculture, the management techniques are now far more sophisticated and rely on fencing, deterrence, and targeted culling programs rather than open warfare. The emus of Western Australia, blissfully unaware of their famous victory, continue to roam the land their ancestors so successfully defended. The character of Major Meredith, beyond the humor, embodies a sense of duty and perseverance. Tasked with an absurd mission, he did not shirk his duty. He returned to the field after the initial failure, a testament to his character. He faced the ridicule and saw the mission through to its conclusion. There's a certain stoic dignity in his persistence, even if that persistence was aimed at a flock of giant, clueless birds. He was a good soldier given a very bad and very strange order. The story has also been the subject of several proposed film adaptations, usually comedies. The idea of a full-scale war movie, shot in the epic style of a film like Saving Private Ryan, but with emus as the antagonists, is an idea that has captured the imagination of many. It's a perfect setup for a satirical film about the follies of war and human arrogance, a cinematic translation of the absurd humor inherent in the historical accounts. The economic pressure of the Great Depression cannot be overstated. Wheat prices were so low that farmers were struggling to even cover the costs of harvesting. Any loss of crop, no matter how small, was a devastating blow. The farmers' desperation was real and profound. This context is what shifts the story from being purely comical to having a layer of tragedy. The war was a symptom of people at the end of their rope, willing to try anything to save their families and their farms. The sole purpose of this elaborate ritual is marriage, It's not about finding yourself or having fun. It's about securing your social and economic future. For a woman, a good match is her entire career path, her pension plan, and her social security, all rolled into one. The choice of the Lewis gun was also influenced by post-World War I surplus. The Australian military, like many others, had a large stockpile of these weapons left over from the war. Deploying them for a pest control exercise was seen as a way to put this surplus equipment to use and provide training for the gunners. It was an attempt at a practical, multi-purpose solution that, in the end, served no purpose at all, other than to waste ammunition and create a legendary story of failure. An adult emu stands between 5 and 6.2 feet tall and can weigh up to 120 pounds. Their legs are among the strongest of any animal, capable of delivering a powerful kick that can rip through metal fences or seriously injure a predator. While they are generally not aggressive towards humans, their sheer size and strength made them an intimidating presence on the farmlands, and their ability to break through standard fencing was the root cause of the entire problem, necessitating the call for more extreme measures. The media coverage at the time framed the conflict in overtly military terms, which only amplified the humor. Headlines used words like campaign, tactics, battle, and retreat. By using the formal language of war to describe a pest control operation, the newspapers created a narrative that was ripe for satire. They were, in essence, co-authors of the absurdity, building up the formal, serious facade that made the eventual failure all the more hilarious for the public. The failure of the truck-mounted gun strategy is a perfect microcosm of the whole affair. The idea seems logical on paper. Combine the firepower of the machine gun with the mobility of a vehicle. But the reality was a comical disaster. The rough ground made aiming impossible, and the emus were simply too fast and agile. It was a clash between industrial-age technology and the raw, unpredictable mechanics of the natural world, and nature won, hands down. One could argue that the emus won not just a military victory, but a psychological one. They caused immense frustration and demoralization among the soldiers, who were used to opponents that behaved in predictable human ways. The emus, complete indifference to military doctrine, and their chaotic, unpredictable behavior was a form of psychological warfare. They broke the soldiers' morale by being utterly, undefeatably themselves. In the end, the Great Emu War is a story with no real villains. The farmers were not evil, they were desperate. The soldiers were not incompetent. They were given an impossible task. And the emus were not an invading army, they were just hungry birds following their instincts. It's a rare and wonderful thing in history. A conflict with no malice, just a series of very poor decisions and a flock of very resilient birds. A perfect storm of absurdity. The contrast between the rigid discipline of the military and the fluid chaos of the emu flock is central to the story's charm. The army represented order, hierarchy, and planning. The emus represented instinct, decentralization, and spontaneous action. The failure of order to impose its will on chaos is a timeless theme, and the Emu War is perhaps its most bizarre and hilarious illustration in the historical record. The 10,000 rounds of ammunition is a number worth dwelling on. It represents a significant amount of potential lethal force. To imagine all that firepower being unleashed with so little effect is to grasp the core of the futility. Each bullet that missed its mark was a small, metallic testament to the profound mismatch between the problem and the solution. The silence after the gunfire, filled only with the sound of retreating emu feet, must have been deafening. The government's eventual turn to barrier fences was a return to a more ancient form of wisdom. For millennia, humans have used fences and walls to separate themselves and their agriculture from the wider wilderness. The decision to use machine guns was a very modern 20th century impulse, a belief that technology could solve any problem. The retreat to the humble fence was a quiet admission that sometimes the old ways are best. The story also serves as a strange lesson in defining, quote, victory. The military operation failed to achieve its objectives and was a public relations disaster, so it was a clear defeat for the army. However, the bounty system and fences eventually did control the emu problem, so the farmers ultimately won their war for survival. The emus, for their part, suffered casualties but thrived as a species and secured a legendary reputation. Perhaps in the end, everyone except Major Meredith won in their own way. Your first meaningful interaction with a potential suitor would likely happen at a heavily populated event, a ball, a garden party, or perhaps a church social. Privacy is a fantasy. You are never, ever truly alone. Every glance is noted, every word potentially overheard. The lack of any real danger to the soldiers is another key element of the story's humor. Unlike a real war, the soldiers were never at risk of being shot back at. Their only dangers were mechanical failure, vehicle accidents, and extreme frustration. This absence of genuine peril allows us to view the entire event as a pure comedy of errors, without the somber weight that accompanies stories of actual combat. It is interesting to note that Sir George Pierce, the Minister of Defense who authorized the war, had a long and distinguished political career. He was instrumental in the founding of the Royal Australian Navy and served as a minister for decades. Yet for many, his legacy is forever tied to this one bizarre decision. It's a reminder of how history can sometimes seize upon a single strange incident and make it the defining feature of a person's public life. The soldiers, reports mentioning the emu's bullet-carrying capacity, might have a grain of scientific truth. An emu's body is covered in a thick layer of shaggy feathers, which could potentially slow down or deflect bullets that weren't perfectly aimed. Furthermore, their bodies are composed of dense muscle and bone. While not truly bulletproof, they were certainly more resilient to small arms fire than a human target, adding another layer of practical difficulty to the soldiers' task. The second attempt at the war, though slightly more successful in terms of numbers, was still a failure by any reasonable measure. The kill-to-cartridge ratio remained abysmal. Killing just under 1,000 emus out of a population of 20,000 was a drop in the bucket. It did little to solve the overall agricultural problem and further cemented the operation's reputation as a fool's errand. It was simply reinforcing failure with more failure. The emu's leader, the ornithologist described, was likely just a more cautious or experienced bird in the flock. However, the soldiers and observers anthropomorphized this behavior, assigning it a military intelligence and structure that almost certainly didn't exist. They saw a general and scouts because their own worldview was military. They were projecting their own logic onto a system that operated on a completely different, more ancient and instinctual logic. Let's consider the vastness of the area of operations. The wheat belt of Western Australia is enormous. The soldiers were trying to police an area of thousands of square kilometers with just 2 guns and a handful of men. The emus had the home field advantage on a massive scale. It was like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. The sheer scale of the landscape ensured their failure from the very beginning. The use of the term war was a deliberate choice by the media and, to some extent, the participants. It framed the event in epic terms. This framing is what makes the story so compelling. If it had been called the Emu Pest Control Program of 1932, it would have been forgotten. By calling it the Great Emu War, it was elevated to the status of a legend, a grand and ridiculous saga. The story of the Great Emu War is, in its own way, a national myth for Australia. It speaks to a certain national character, a wry, self-deprecating humor, a skepticism of authority, and a deep, abiding connection to a strange and often unforgiving landscape. It's a story that could only have happened in Australia, and it's one that the country has embraced with a unique sense of pride in its own absurdity. The cinematographer's presence is a wonderfully modern touch. The desire to capture and broadcast the event for propaganda purposes is a very 20th century phenomenon. The fact that the propaganda mission backfired and instead produced a record of failure adds a perfect layer of irony. The camera, intended to document a triumph, instead immortalized a farce for future generations to enjoy. The final legacy of the Emu War is a quiet reminder of the complexity of ecosystems. The arrival of the emus was not an invasion, but a consequence of a chain of events: drought, land clearing, and the introduction of a new, concentrated food source. The failed military response is a testament to the fact that ecological problems rarely have simple, violent solutions. They require a more holistic understanding of the systems at play. Enter the chaperone. This is usually your mother, an aunt, or a trusted older woman. She is your shadow, your bodyguard, and your social auditor, all in one. Her job is to ensure that no breach of propriety, no unseemly touch or whispered secret occurs. So ends the tale of the Great Emu War, a conflict where the enemy was disorganized, leaderless, and utterly unaware it was fighting. A war won not by tactics, but by an unyielding commitment to eating and scattering. It remains a perfect historical anecdote, a soothingly absurd story of complete and total failure, and a reminder that sometimes the best course of action is to just build a better fence. There's a certain poetry in the fact that the two species on the Australian coat of arms, the emu and the kangaroo, are often considered pests by farmers. The national symbols are also at times a national nuisance. This duality captures the complex relationship Australians have with their native wildlife, a mix of pride, affection, and deep frustration. The Emu War is the ultimate expression of that frustration. If we were to draw a modern analogy, the Great Emu War is like trying to solve a complex software bug by hitting the computer with a hammer. It's the application of brute force to a problem that requires a nuanced, intelligent solution. The hammer might feel satisfying to swing, but it's unlikely to fix the underlying code, and you'll probably just end up breaking something else in the process, like your fence. The story has also become a kind of historical litmus test for a sense of humor. If you can appreciate the sublime comedy of the Australian military being outmaneuvered by a flock of large birds, you likely have a good grasp of irony and absurdity. It's a story that filters out the overly serious and rewards those who can find the humor in human folly. The sheer numbers involved on the emu side are staggering. 20,000 emus descending on a region is a biological event on a massive scale. It's easy to lose sight of this and focus on the humor, but for the people on the ground it must have felt like a genuine plague of biblical proportions. The air would have been thick with the birds, deep drumming calls, and the ground would have trembled under their feet. As we leave the sun-bleached plains of Australia, we can carry with us the image of the victorious emu standing tall amidst the wheat, a silent, feathered monument to the beautiful, unpredictable chaos of the natural world. It's a strangely comforting thought that no matter how advanced our plans or powerful our tools, some things simply refuse to be managed and continue on their own strange, wonderful, and unstoppable path. Now let's turn our attention from the battlefield to the dining table. We're going to trace the history of an object so common, so ubiquitous, that we never give it a second thought, and yet its journey to acceptance was a long and surprisingly controversial one. We are going to explore the dramatic and often scandalous history of the fork. Today it sits innocently beside our plate, but for centuries this simple tool was seen as decadent, unmanly, and even an instrument of the devil himself. Its story is a perfect illustration of how the most mundane aspects of our lives are steeped in forgotten history. The earliest ancestors of the fork were not for putting food in one's mouth. In ancient Greece and Rome, wealthy households used large, two-pronged implements, more like small pitchforks, for carving and serving large joints of meat. They were kitchen tools used by cooks and slaves to hold a roast steady while it was being sliced. The idea of an individual using a small version to eat was completely alien. For that, nature had provided the perfect tools: your fingers. Spoons for liquids and knives for cutting were common, but the personal fork was nowhere to be seen. Eating with your hands was the universal norm. The fork's journey to the European dinner table begins in the Byzantine Empire, the sophisticated eastern remnant of the Roman world. It was here, in the opulent courts of Constantinople, that the small personal fork first came into use among the aristocracy. And it was from here that it made its first disastrous foray into Western Europe. In the 11th century, a Byzantine princess named Theodora Anna Dukaina married Domenico Salvo, the Doge of Venice. She brought with her a trousseau of luxuries, including a case of two-pronged golden forks, which she used at her wedding feast, much to the horror of the local clergy. The Venetian court was shocked. The use of this artificial instrument was seen as an insult to God. The local clergy, particularly the fiery cardinal and saint Peter Damian, condemned the princess for her decadence. He railed against her, arguing that God in his wisdom had provided humans with natural forks, their fingers, and to substitute them with a man-made metal tool was a sign of excessive pride and a perversion of the natural order. Her use of the fork was seen as a symptom of the moral decay and foreign affectation of the Byzantines. In this world of suffocating supervision, you must learn to speak a different language. The fan, for instance, is not just for keeping cool. It's a complex signaling device. Drawing it across your cheek means, "I love you," while dropping it means, "We will be friends." When the unfortunate princess died a few years later from a degenerative illness, the clergy seized upon it as proof of divine retribution. Peter Damian wrote with grim satisfaction that her gruesome death was God's punishment for her sinful vanity and her use of those little golden forks. Her body, he claimed, had rotted away as a consequence of her luxurious habits. This story spread, and for centuries, the fork was associated with sin, vanity, and a divinely punished Byzantine princess. It was a terrible piece of public relations for the nascent utensil. For the next few centuries, the fork remained a rare curiosity in Europe, confined mostly to Italy, where trade with the Byzantine world kept the idea alive. Even there, it was used primarily for eating sticky or syrupy foods that would be messy to handle with fingers. Most of Europe, however, remained deeply suspicious. The fork was seen as effeminate and unmanly. A real man ate with his hands and his knife. To use a fork was to be delicate, foppish, and suspiciously foreign, probably Italian. The association with weakness and affectation would cling to the fork for a long, long time. The devil himself was even brought into the argument against the fork. In a world where the devil was often depicted holding a pitchfork, the visual similarity of the small eating fork was too much for some to ignore. It was seen as a miniature version of Satan's preferred instrument, a tool of hell brought to the Christian dinner table. To eat with a fork was, in a very literal sense, to sup with the devil. This theological and superstitious resistance created a powerful barrier to its adoption across most of the continent. The tide began to turn, slowly, in the 16th century, thanks in large part to another influential woman, Catherine de' Medici. When she traveled from Italy to France in 1533 to marry the future King Henry II, she brought with her a retinue of Italian chefs and a host of Italian customs, including the use of the fork. The French court, always keen on new trends and fashions, began to adopt the practice. It became a marker of high status and sophistication, a way for the aristocracy to distinguish themselves from the common people. However, even in the fashionable French court, the fork was not immediately embraced by everyone. It was still seen by many as an awkward and pretentious device. The philosopher Michel de Montaigne wrote about how clumsy he felt using one, and how he often reverted to his fingers out of habit. The adoption of the fork was also hampered by the large, stiff, rough collars that were fashionable at the time. Eating with your hands became messy and difficult when wearing a giant, starched collar, so a long-handled fork became a practical, if still somewhat awkward, solution. By the 17th century, the fork was becoming more established among the upper classes in France and Italy. But it faced staunch resistance in other parts of Europe, particularly in England. The English viewed the fork as a ridiculous Italian affectation. In 1608, an English traveler named Thomas Courtship published a book about his journeys in Europe, in which he described with fascination the Italian custom of using forks. He was so taken with the practice that he adopted it himself upon his return to England, earning him endless mockery and the nickname furcifer, which meant fork-bearer, but was also a Latin term for a scoundrel. English society saw Courtship and his fork as a joke. Men who used forks were considered unmanly and effeminate. The common saying was that a man needed nothing more than his knife and his hands to eat his meat. The fork was for women, dandies, and Italians, which for many Englishmen of the period were basically the same thing. This cultural resistance was powerful, and for another century the fork remained a rarity in England, a symbol of foreign strangeness rather than civilized dining. The design of the fork itself was also evolving. The early two-pronged models were excellent for spearing pieces of food, but not very useful for scooping. They were more like a small, personal spear. It was in the late 17th and early 18th centuries in France that the design began to change. A third, and then a fourth, tine or prong was added. The tines were also curved slightly, which allowed the fork to be used for scooping up food like peas, making it a much more versatile and practical tool, closer to the one we know today. It was really the 18th century when the fork finally began to conquer Europe. As ideas about hygiene and refinement began to shift, the notion of everyone at the table dipping their greasy fingers into a shared serving dish started to seem less appealing. The fork offered a more sanitary, more delicate way of eating. It became a key part of a broader cultural shift towards what the sociologist Norbert Elias would later call the civilizing process. a gradual refinement of manners and control of bodily functions that separated the elite from the masses. By the mid-18th century, the fork had become a standard item in the tableware sets of the European aristocracy and the rising middle class. In Germany and England, the final bastions of resistance, it was finally accepted as a normal part of dining. The association with effeminacy faded as it became ubiquitous among the respectable classes. It was no longer a sign of being Italian, it was a sign of being civilized. The journey from diabolical instrument to a marker of good breeding was nearly complete.